Take a look here. The Hamas terror group firing rockets from Rafah at the Kerem Shalom crossing used by trucks carrying aid over into Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces saying the attack was fired from an area right near the Rafah crossing with Egypt, which is also used to facilitate aid to Gaza, and it was also a short distance away from civilian shelters. The IDF releasing video of the attack seen there, saying at least 10 people were injured. Israel has carried out strikes now in Rafah in response, including striking the launch sites. Want to talk about all of this and the latest developments there in the Middle East. So let's bring in Enya Kervin, a friend of the show, the senior director of the Israel program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's great to be here as always.
Course. Well, first off, I do want to talk a little bit about this Hamas attack. A lot of details here still unknown, but information is kind of slowly coming in. So overall, my question for you, what do we know so far about this, and what is the significance?
Sure. So the event was very significant and for many reasons, and I think we need to unpack a little bit of that. So let's go ahead. Let's start with the hostage negotiations because it plays into the timing. So there have not been successful hostage exchanges since last year. And for the past several months, Jerusalem and DC have been working with partners to try and bring more of the over 130 Israeli and some American hostages home from Gaza unsuccessfully. And during this period, while this intense diplomacy has been happening to try and bring the hostages home, DC has been pressuring Israel for two things: to surge aid into Gaza and to pull back on its military operations. And specifically what DC means by pulling back, the military operations was not going forward with an operation Rafah. Rafah is the southernmost town in Gaza. It abuts the border with Egypt, and it is a critical military target for Israel because it houses the remainder of the Hamas military battalions. There are multiple intact battalions in Rafah. Military infrastructure is there. So the whole time in the past several months, the U.S. has been pressuring Israel not to move forward with the Rafah operations while these hostage negotiations were going on, which brings us to the present time. So Israel has the most comprehensive hostage package on the table. It presented it to Hamas last week. It is backed by the U.S. Secretary Blinken called it extraordinarily generous on the part of Israel. And Israel's been waiting on pins and needles to get a response from Hamas, hoping this might be it and this might bring more hostages home. However, this response by Hamas, this attack on the Kerem Shalom crossing, as you mentioned, that Hamas took credit for, that caused casualties on the Israeli side, happened while Israel is waiting for a response to this generous hostage offer. So the timing is significant. The rockets came from Rafah. They came from this town that Israel says it must go into to finally eliminate the Hamas military infrastructure that Biden has been pressuring Israel to leave. So that's where the rockets came from. And they hit the humanitarian crossing, which is where Israel lets in a huge portion of the humanitarian aid that relieves the suffering of the Gazan people. So Josh, you asked me what it means. What it means is Hamas has very little interest in coming to any kind of peaceful agreement with Israel, and that Hamas cares very little about civilians in Gaza.
And I want to talk about some of the other developments here, because we did learn not too long ago here that Hezbollah has now fired dozens upon dozens of rockets over at northern Israel again today. And what a lot of people don't realize is this is kind of going on pretty much on a daily basis, where you're having these rockets, these missiles that are fired from Hezbollah over into northern Israel.
Josh, I'm so glad you brought that up because I believe it is terribly underreported. The truth is that Israel has been under attack on its northern border for months. It has over 100,000 people who have been evacuated from their homes, from their businesses, from their farms in the north of the community. These are Israeli Jews, these are Druze, these are Muslims. All Muslim Israelis have been forced out of their homes and their communities for several months while Israel has been under pretty much constant attack. Another thing that is very underreported, that since early this year, there have been more rockets coming in from Lebanon than there have from Gaza. So this is definitely a hot arena. This is definitely a low grade but intense conflict going on there. And what what is important for everyone to understand is that Hezbollah is a huge non-state actor. They are the most armed non-state actor in the world. They have 150,000 rockets in their arsenal, and they are a major strategic threat to Israel. So while Israel is prosecuting this war in Gaza and trying to get its hostages back and trying to finish the job there, it also has to keep its sights and its military and its personnel and its resources directed to the north, where there is an even greater threat that is looming and that will eventually have to be dealt with.
There are reports that are circulating now, speaking more about a possible truce deal, a hostage release and ceasefire deal. There's reports that are starting to circulate that the U.S. had actually urged Israel to send a delegation there for those hostage talks. And it seems as though Netanyahu has kind of pushed back and said, not just yet, we'll see where things go. What does that tell you about the plan overall if Israel is to decide not to send a delegation?
So Israel wants these hostages back. It is very much an open wound in the Israeli psyche that over 130 hostages remain in Israel. Israelis know that a lot of these people are dead. Israel's seen very little signs of life from these people, and it is an ongoing daily trauma in this country. I'm reporting from Israel right now. So and by dragging these hostage negotiations out and constantly coming back to the table and perniciously releasing these videos of hostages, months and months at a time with nothing, and then releasing a video of a hostage underground, obviously under duress. It's psychological warfare, and Israelis recognize this, and the government recognizes this, and yet the desire to bring those people home continues to compel Israelis to go back into these negotiations. Now, as I said, it's been months without a result, and people are beginning to get the feeling here that this is theater. This has become a way for Hamas to stay in the headlines, which was always their goal. Early on in this war, Hamas leaders went on broadcast and said, people have forgotten about us. There's a war in Ukraine. The U.S. is focused in China. We want to be on the top of the global agenda. And this tactic, this psychological warfare, this stringing on into these endless negotiations, not only keeps pressure on Israel to end the Gaza operation, it rises anti-Semitism, it creates these horrible protests that you see on these campuses, and it also torments Israelis. So it's a successful strategy by Hamas. And I think this time, Netanyahu said, we're not going to send a delegation until we understand that there's actually hope that this deal could happen.
And I want to talk a little bit more about those protests here. This is actually video of one of many that have happened over the last several days, coming in Friday from Portland State University. As you can see, those clashes between law enforcement and some of the protesters there, the Gaza war protesters. Now, these protests that are happening, do they really, because they are against Israel, give Hamas any sort of, let's say, additional leverage in talks of a deal?
I would hope not. But I think that the truth is that, we're coming up on an election season, and these images are not what the Biden administration wants to have on the nightly news. This shows chaos. This shows a country that is out of control. This shows young people that are causing anarchy on our campuses. So I think that I don't know how much effect they have on the deals when the rubber hits the road, but I do know that this pressures the Biden administration. And I'll just say, I think they're short-sighted on the part of these campuses and these young people that are going out and doing this, because the vast majority of Americans look at these chaotic, these violent protests with disgust. And I think that the vast majority of Americans understand that this is a truly un-American scene playing out on our college campuses. And my bold prediction is that these will backfire. These are going to hurt Biden. And whether they have an effect on the deal and when the rubber hits the road, I doubt it. But I do think that they are having a corrosive effect and they are turning people against these movements.
And there are so many different topics to talk about, so we are kind of jumping around, but that's, the situation that's been playing out over the last several months. Israel giving Hamas an ultimatum, so to speak, when it comes to that Rafah offensive. Do we know what we expect the Rafah operation is going to look like, and how would it, I guess, overall differ from the airstrikes that we've already seen there in Rafah?
Sure. So airstrikes are definitely going to be part of what comes next. But here's what's really important to understand about Rafah. There are 1 million Gazans, civilians in Rafah. Israel wants those civilians evacuated before it goes in for a major military operation to finally defeat the Hamas military infrastructure and to try and retrieve the hostages that the IDF believes to be in Rafah. So what Israel would like to do and what it has plans to do, and what the Wall Street Journal has reported multiple times, that there is movement in this arena. It's building humanitarian camps and humanitarian areas in central Gaza. And there was a report in the Wall Street Journal that actually laid it out. They said there are going to be potentially 15 different camps with up to 25,000 housing units in each one. And what Israel's talking about is a phased evacuation of these people, the civilians, out of Gaza. The IDF would be watching the route to make sure that no terrorists come out, and they would be placed into these newly established humanitarian areas, which have been built and set up in coordination with Arab partners. And they would remain there or go back to their homes either in central Gaza or in northern Gaza. So we're talking about a slow and IDF hopes orderly sector by sector maneuver of civilians out of Rafah before the operation begins. From what I understand, the sticking point is the timing here, because Israel believes it can move these civilians in a matter of weeks. And if you looked at the way they move civilians out of the north and out of central Gaza, you saw what they did. There was a grid system that was block by block, where every day they would release information on social media and drop leaflets as to which blocks needed to be evacuated in that day. And they successfully managed to move this population into Rafah, and now they need to get people out. And Josh, it makes sense. You'd want the civilians. It's not sustainable to have 1.5 million civilians in a city that was built for 300,000 civilians. You need to get them out. They need to go back to their communities where they came from. They need to start to rebuild eventually. And this needs to be done in fashion, and the U.S. can help by backing the operation, by being involved, and by supporting the Israelis in getting these people back so that they can finally finish the job in Rafah.
And that leads me to another question here, because the IDF has said that some of those hostages that are believed to be in Rafah, they say intelligence has led them to believe that that is where those hostages are. Several of them are American hostages. So why is it overall, just in your expert opinion, that the U.S. is opposing this operation in Rafah?
So unfortunately, Josh, I think it has to do with the timing. I think that the U.S. must understand that people will have to leave Rafah. They must understand that it's unsustainable to have that many people on the Egypt southern border. And ultimately, the U.S. has been supportive of Israel's goal to destroy this designated terror organization. The U.S. designates Hamas as a terrorist organization. Hamas was responsible for dozens of U.S. murders on October 7th. And the U.S. says it supports the goal to destroy Hamas. And there's no way of removing its military capabilities without first going into its last bastion, into Rafah. So in my opinion, the only reason I can think where the Biden administration would oppose this operation is because they're worried about the visuals of moving this massive amount of civilians as we get close to November, unfortunately.
All right. Enya Kraveen there at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, a friend of the show. We appreciate you always coming on to break down all of these headlines as they do develop. Is there anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
No, Josh, I think we really covered it this time. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.